Everybody.
So they're popular.
Well, everybody needs money. So it's kind of like makes sense. It's like everybody's here like, yes, let's listen to this. Like everybody's like, oh shit, I need to figure out how to make money.
That silly little thing. I can't just make games.
I mean, it's true. It's really disappointing in many ways. It's like, it would be nice to just make video games and not have to worry about it.
That would be the dream.
That will be the dream.
Wait, there's not some country that'll just pay you to make games? And
No. There's barely companies that will pay you to make games.
I was going to say Valve barely.
Yes. There's a bunch of companies that will like burn you out for pay, but it's the most depressing pre-talk I've ever given. Wouldn't it be nice to just do the thing we love? Yeah, no.
The thing we love is expensive.
Well, I think they closed the door.
Okay, so I think we're ready.
Is that our good sign?
Are we good to go?
We're good to go.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We are doing a fun little talk on funding. I know nobody's really here to just hear me talk. I do have to remind everybody this is actually presented by Xsolla Funding Club. I'm going to fly through that part because I've done it so many times. I'm kind of sick of it, but it's super interesting. So, 2 platforms, 1 application. We've had roughly 1,500 games submitted, about 800 approved. Of those, almost 100 have found funding, which is about 50x better than my normal hit rate when I was at a publisher. And then we have another thing that we're launching. I need to preface this, it is not available for investors outside of the US now. It's a game investment platform which allows multiple investors to co-invest in one project. We're just trying to find more ways to get developers money easily and quickly. I forgot the rest of the slides. So here's this. This is 1,100. We had a lot more than that. Roughly $30 million plus in funding has been found for developers through the club. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of this. There's little brochures on everybody's chair. Happy to talk more about it later, but I didn't spend all the money to fly here to talk to Rami about this stuff. Game investment platform as well, like I mentioned. Happy to send everybody this later, but the commercial break's over. Let's get into it. So, Rami, let's talk about this. Most people know how you got started.
Hi. I just want to check what was on the screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most people know most of the story how you got started.
Right.
Which is not necessarily past performance, not necessarily indicative of future results. But for those who don't know, really quickly, how did you get started? How did the studio get funded the first time?
Right. So before this, I used to be at a studio called Vlaambeer, and the thing with asking how we got started is just that, in funding, things move so fast. Like so fast that if you ask me what advice I'd give a starting studio, like based on my experience at Vlaambeer, it would be to make Flash games. And they don't exist anymore. So, like as time changes, your approach to funding has to change. Back then, there were no publishers, there were no funds, there were no grants. Like there was just kind of nothing because indie games were new. So we started with Flash games, and we funded like 10K, 30K by selling some Flash games for, one of those sites that school kids used to play games at. And then we were one of Devolver Digital's first ever indie games, and they funded us for a relatively small amount of money back then, and then it just sort of grew. But it was very clear that one of the advantages we had being an early mover in indie was just that we were always a little bit ahead of things, and that's kind of what kept the ball rolling. So from a funding perspective, your biggest challenge is always getting the ball rolling, because Correct. As soon as it rolls, you can find ways to keep it rolling.
So given the difference between then and now, we'll talk about the other thing in a minute. What is the biggest difference you've seen from then? Obviously, there's way more availability of tools, platforms, access, but there's also way more content. So what are you seeing? And I know you advise a ton of indies. What are you seeing that's working and not working right now in that space?
I mean, it's working really well and utterly broken at the same time, which I think is sort of the ultimate reality of games, right? Like, it's easier than ever to get access to funding, right? There's thousands of funding sources from grants, publishers, investment, VC, whatever. Platforms will fund games at this point. But because there is so many developers, so much competition, so many other people vying for that same money, the level you need to be at to get to that money is a lot more complicated. So the biggest gap that there is right now is actually getting your first thing going to the point where you can get funding. So prototype funds, $10,000, $30,000, like the amount of money you need to get a small team working for 6 months, if they're not too dependent on money, right? Like students or young developers, people with a second job. The space to actually like get a good artist on board to make that pitch deck, right? Like get a prototype going to make sure that you can test your hypothesis, getting a look at your pitch deck that isn't just like, oh, hey, we're making a game, you know, like you see a lot of pitch decks and you know the same mistakes everybody makes. You can tell when a programmer made a pitch deck because it's just about how it works and not about why it matters, or when an artist makes a pitch deck and it's pretty images, but I don't know what it is, right? And then all, you know, designers being very excited about explaining their mechanics, but not why those mechanics are there, right? You start seeing these patterns, and very often it's just because nobody's looking at the business side of things. And I think that first start, that's really the biggest gap right now.
So again, I always just say this, the business person is the person they need the most sometimes, but they can afford the least, right? So you're seeing that a lot. I mean, I know you're talking to a ton of devs. So what is the kind of the piece of advice that you seem to be giving them the most when you're seeing these pitches or talking to them about the games? What are these things that are consistently like you're going, oh God, they should know this already?
Well, I think there's two, right? The first one is I think people misunderstand what they're selling, right? I think a lot of game developers think that when you talk to a publisher, you talk to a funding partner, that what you're selling is a game. What you're selling is a business case, which is separate from a game, right? Like the game is sort of like the thing underpinning your business case, and you need to prove the game to sell the business case. But ultimately what you're selling is a business case. An investor, a publisher, whoever is trying to invest an amount of money, and then they're trying to multiply that money 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times, whatever it is. And your biggest challenge is to convince them that that part will work. Because everything else is their problem. Like, with all due respect, like, you know, if you make a really bad investment bet, that's great for the developer because they have the money now to make the video game, right?
Not always great, but
right, it can be bad, but like the point is that what you're selling is a business case. And I think a lot of developers mistake it for selling a game, so when they pitch, they focus on the game, and all they want to talk about is the game, but they don't talk about you know, who is this game for? You know, how is the budget made up? Like, what comparative analysis do we have? Is there something in the market that we can go up against, or is there nothing in the market? And is there an argument to be made that that's why it should exist, right? How you're going to earn your money? You know, what kind of place you think this game will have? Those things are equally important. And the thing is, as a developer, those are big questions, and you don't have to answer them, because it's not entirely your job. That's the investor's job to do that due diligence. The second thing, and this one annoys me very much, is that I think publishers at large have convinced independent developers that publishers fund indie games. And they kind of do, but they kind of don't, right? The idea is that a publisher buys publishing rights. That's their job. They buy the publishing rights, and then with the money they give you for the publishing rights, you fund your own video game. Right, and it's a very subtle difference, but I think it's important for developers, because if you imagine, I come to you with a game and I say, okay, it's a multiplayer game, I have 3 people, they need $100,000 salary for the entire project, so that's $300,000. Then you go like, oh, yeah, no, maybe, or maybe you go like, we don't want that, but maybe you'll fund that. Right, and then if that game turns out to be a game about astronauts backstabbing each other called Among Us, and I come back to you for Among Us 2, I still need $300,000 to make that game. But I'm not going to ask for $300,000. I'm going to ask for like millions and millions of dollars, because there's now brand recognition and other values. So I think it's important for indies to sort of separate the two. And I think publishers have done a really good job of making us believe that they have to be the same, your budget and what you're asking for. But if you have a game that's really good, like I had a game the other day that was a $700,000 budget, and they funded for $7.5 million, just because, you know, they had the team.
Yeah, now I'm going to be mad at you. You didn't send that to my way?
I think they actually, no, they didn't reach out. No, that's true.
It's fine. Not offended.
I'm a consultant, right? Like, I help them. So I don't tell them you have to talk to these people. I'm like, here's a list of people you can talk to. But I think those two things are really important, in my opinion, is A, understand that you're selling a business case, and the game is the thing underpinning the business case. And B, the publisher is not necessarily the thing that's funding you. You have to fund yourself, and you have to understand that what you're doing is you're selling rights. You're selling the rights to publish this game, and you're selling the rights for these publishers to exploit your title, to sell it, to make money with it, and to pay you a percentage of your own work. That's the thing you're selling. And the reason you do that is to move that risk away from you.
Sure.
Right? And ultimately, that's the goal of funding. You could probably self-fund, right? Or you could take the risk and keep the risk, get a mortgage, take a loan. But the risk stays on your side then.
Correct.
When you move it to an investor or a publisher, they're far more equipped to take those risks. So that's really the job. It's just be like, okay, here's the risk. You take that risk. Here's the opportunity. You take the opportunity, right? And then I take part of that opportunity back. That's the actual way that works. And, understanding that makes pitching easier. Because
Sure.
now you understand what the deal is, right?
Well, I think the business case piece is a big key. For me, it's the question that always drives me nuts is them not telling me who the game's for.
Yeah.
I'm like, that as an investor or publisher, that's not my job. My job is to help you reach that audience,
Right.
but your job is to tell me who it's for. And
Yep.
when they say, well, and most people know, when you say everybody, I run away.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, everybody's nobody, right? I always teach pitching the same way. I tell people 5 questions, answer them in that order, right? It's who, saw what opportunity, to make what, how can you benefit, what do we need? So who is who are you? And you put in everything that is like a plus for you. Like I've been in the industry, I've shipped a game, I worked on a successful title, whatever
This
it
many
is.
followers, this many awards, whatever.
Saw what opportunity. That's the part where you have to explain, why am I making this game? And you know, a lot of developers come to me and they're like, well, you know,
Because I want to make it.
but that's not the answer. You want to make it. Why do you want to make it then? Like, tell me, like, explain to me why you are excited about the game. Because otherwise, it's really hard for me to be excited about the game, right? To make what? That's where you define your game. It's only a fifth of your presentation is how you define the game, and then how can you benefit? How can an investor make money? What do we need? And I stop with what do we need. I end with the budget. I teach everybody end with the budget. And this is just I used to be in retail. And we were always taught, like, don't mention the price of the laptop until you've sold them on the laptop. And then when they say, like, oh, that's too much, find the one that's slightly cheaper and show them that one. Oh, this one is also pretty good.
That's an old school sales tactic, by the way.
Old school
right?
sales,
The
right?
first one to mention the price loses, right?
Yeah, because if I go to you and I say, like, okay, I have a game, it's $1 million, and then I tell you everything about the game, the entire presentation, you're sitting there, is this $1 million? Is this $1 million game? Is this $1 million game? And then when you see the graphics and you're like, $500,000 graphics, that's a mark against the game. Well, if I give you the entire pitch and at the end I say it's $1 million, if your overall impression of the game is $1 million, you're going to be okay with it. So, you know, it's just that order always works for me. But I think it's that second question, saw what opportunity. What is the opportunity? What are you chasing? Like, why does this game need to exist? I miss that in a lot of pitches. And who is it for is a big part of it.
So, and I think that's key. So I love that we're talking about this because I think everybody knows how outspoken you are about helping indies, protecting indies, doing all this stuff. And I think one of the things they can do to protect themselves is be better prepared to pitch.
Right.
Know what they're worth, know who the audience is, know who the value, and have an idea how much money the game actually can make.
Yeah.
Because then you can help dictate. And then it goes into that second piece, which you talked about, where then you're selling rights because you know how much money.
Wow. I coughed.
That was a cough.
Was that a cough? Sorry about that.
Wow. Okay. Well, everybody's
So
awake now.
apologies for having the most Cthulhu-esque cough in the history of ever. As soon as I can hear again, I will. Wow. My sincere apologies. I will never cough again.
Okay, so we're gonna change it up a little bit. I mentioned I was gonna ask this, so you can just. What are you working on now?
Oh my God. Yeah. So lots of things, right? I have a bad habit of starting things when I have time. So I'm working on a new edition of a conference called Game Dev World, online conference.
Well, let's talk. I do want to talk about that for 2 minutes.
Right.
Let's talk about why you started it and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So Game Dev World is a multilingual conference. So one of the things that we realize is that a lot of conferences are in English, and that makes a barrier of entry for people who don't speak English. But it also means that you don't actually get to listen to knowledge from people who don't speak English. So all the knowledge that's stuck in French, in Russian, in Spanish, in Brazilian Portuguese, and like all these languages is just entirely lost to us because they don't speak English, and all the knowledge that's stuck in English is lost to them because they don't speak English. So what we did is we made a conference. It's online only. It's live translated across 8 or 9 of the biggest languages on Earth. So it's a huge undertaking. Working on that, also with some support from Xsolla there.
Well, that's not why I asked about it.
But I do want to acknowledge it because it is much appreciated. And then I'm doing a lot of consulting at the moment, so I'm helping indies figure out funding-related question, pitching-related question, design-related questions, just team management questions, stuff like that. And then I'm, in the background, I'm sort of working on spinning up something bigger. It's also part of the reason I'm here. But it's early. Like, there's not much to talk about right now, but it's...
Well, so I'm going to dig in. I'm not going to go into depth because I know it.
All right.
Dig in. So here's a great question. Obviously, you had quite a bit of success before, but what you're working on now, I'm assuming you're going to have to go try to get funding.
Yes. Yeah, there's always funding. And, like, it's funny because you go in this industry, you help other developers out. So I also invest in some smaller indie games, but, like, usually for the things you want to do, you kind of run in that situation where you can't self-fund it very frequently. And also, even if I could self-fund it, I would like to move some of the risk away from me. Like, I think it's just good business to move that risk away from yourself a bit and make sure that you have partners that are more equipped to take on risk and that allow you to use resources in a smarter way. So, I started as an indie because I was anti-publisher. Like that,
that's when we first met.
That's when
Do you remember when we first met?
Yeah, no.
I remember when we first met.
That was not, like, I was just anti-publisher, but that was the entire culture. Is we were against the idea of taking money from somebody to make games. And it made sense back then. Like, it was counterculture. Like, we were kids, we were trying to kick against something. But now, like, it just makes so much sense to move that risk away from you, especially as the budgets keep ballooning. Like, indie games nowadays aren't $30,000 games. They're like $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $1 million. And if you're an indie in this audience and you look at your budget and you're like, our budget is 70,000, then you're not paying yourself the right amount of money because there's genuinely not a game in the world. Well, if you make something really small, maybe 70,000. But, like, in general, if you're in Europe and assuming you're attending these talks, you're likely in Europe, you're going to be looking at a 1-2 year development. You're looking at the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you should probably be asking for that, because why would you keep all that other risk with you? Like, you're still paying for it, whether it's time or money. Well,
it's opportunity cost, right? I think we go back to some basic economics, and I talk about this a lot, right? Even if you pay yourself a moderate salary over that period of time, if you're doing it full time, what would that have been?
Question for you.
Yes.
For the audience, technically, but for you. I give you a pitch. It's a game, and you look at it. You're like, it's a $250,000 game, right? Which pitch would you be more likely to continue talking about? The pitch where I give you that game and I say it's $300,000, or the pitch where I give that to you and I say it's $100,000?
Honestly, the higher pitch. I will tell you, a bigger red flag for me is a budget that I know is too low.
Right? Because they won't be able to ship it.
Well, and I also know that means they're coming back to me later. They're either going to miss milestones, I'm going to get held hostage at the end of development.
Right.
And I know this is not popular among a lot of indie devs, and we talked about this, because the first time you met me, you really didn't want to like me because I was at a publisher. So I remember this very clearly.
Yep.
and it wasn't a you didn't like me, but you didn't like the fact that I was at a publisher.
Yep.
I've been burned by developers at least a dozen times who come back towards the end of development, and it's like, you failed a milestone pretty badly, and it's like, well, you give us the money, or the game doesn't ship, and we go out of business.
Yep.
So,
and that's a bad story for you in the end.
Sure. Here's the thing. Once I start paying for that risk, it shifts significantly.
Yep.
And if that game doesn't ship, at some point, especially if I'm funding all of the development, I've got 100% of the risk. And so I get that there's blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah.
This is also why I ask developers to be very specific about how much money have you put in, not just cash, but sweat equity.
Yep.
And sometimes that's actually to justify a fairer royalty rate.
Yep.
But at some point, that shifts very much the risk on my side, and especially if I'm not calculating publishing costs as part of the royalty rate. So if it's a $500,000 game, and I'm funding $400,000 of it, and then I've got $200,000 in publishing costs, right? I'm $600,000 in, they're $100,000 in. So sure, but now I've been paying your salary for 2 years, and I'm $100,000. So the risk gets really shifted. So absolutely, I'd rather have a higher budget that's accurate.
Yeah.
The other thing is, please don't give me round numbers. Don't come to me with a budget that's exactly $1 million. Exactly $500,000, unless you can show me why it's exact, because that will make me question the accuracy of your budget.
Yeah, you just went and added, you're just like, oh, $1 million sounds nice.
Well, because then I know you most likely rounded up insignificantly.
Yeah. You know how many indies you come across that end up at $1 million because they round down?
Yes.
I'm just like, why would you round up? Like, what's wrong with you?
And I will
Probably
actually
don't
say,
round.
so one of the things in hosting Funding Club and having 180, I talk to a lot of publishers and investors, and that's actually a pet peeve.
Yeah.
They get more turned off by budgets being under than over.
Yeah.
Like, how do you make this game for $300,000?
Because they know their business, right? They're looking at risk, and if the risk of being at too low a budget means the risk is that you don't ship. The risk of too high a budget is a lower risk of not recouping, is a higher risk of not recouping, which investors have money. That's why they invest, right? Like,
Well,
they're not looking to
investors
minimize.
are gamblers a little bit.
Right.
They're looking to minimize risk, but they're also gamblers.
They're mostly looking to maximize their opportunity. They want to, for their dollar, they want 3.
So this is the other. This is one of the things I'll point out difference that I've learned, and I didn't know this until 3 or 4 years ago when I started talking. Because over a while, as you were with publishers, I was with traditional investors.
Right.
Because I was dealing with Sand Hill and I couldn't stand them.
Right.
Like now we actually have investors in the space that actually know games,
Right.
come from games. But because of that, they also know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So the mismanagement of the budgets, but also not understanding what the potential for the game is. So we talk about forecasting and budget.
Right. Yeah.
And here's a little pet peeve. When you give me a budget, and then you give me, oh, I'm going to sell 100,000 units at $10 a unit. So at $1 million, I break even. I'm like,
Right.
Steam, taxes, like you're
Yep.
lucky to get
30% goes off, and then off the 30%, 50%
so you're
goes.
like you're 50%, right?
Yeah.
And so just not knowing that you don't know the business well enough
Right.
to understand that.
Yep.
It's not necessarily a red flag, but it's a yellow flag, right?
You know, they're developers. They don't have to understand the business, but they should understand the business enough that when they come to you with a budget, it should make sense. What I teach people is comparative analysis,
Yep.
right? Find a game. I use Boxlider. So there's this, for people who don't know the Boxlider number, there's an indie called Mike's Boxlider. He figured out that there's a correlation between the amount of reviews a game has on Steam and the amount of units shipped. And basically, they just do a questionnaire among indies every year to figure out what that ratio is. And at the moment, it's 1 to 47. I think every review means 47 units sold, right? So you can use that as like a soft estimate of how much a game made. You're not taking into account discounts, but we're going to leave that out for now. So basically, what you can do is you can take your budget, then take 70% of your budget, find a game that, with the Boxlider method, made about 70% of your game. That's your worst case scenario. Then you do one that's 130% that takes Steam's cut. That's 30%. So now you're approximately break even. And then you do one that's 300%. So you triple your investment. And what you do is very simple. That 70% game, look at that game. If your game blows it out of the water, we're good. If your game is equal to that, your budget is too high. If your game is worse than that, just stop. Yeah, just dump the project, do something new. Even if you care about it, nobody's going to fund it, right? Then 130% game, your game should be approximately equal. Right, you should look at it and you should be like an average customer, should look at these two games and go like, both seem good. And in the 300% game, you don't have to be that good, but you have to at least be able to convince me that you could be as good, right? And if those 3 numbers work, your budget is fine. Because that's how investors are going to look at it. They're going to look like, how is this going to fall in the market? So you do 70, 130, 300%. If your game is better than the 300% game, ask for more money. Like, it's fine. Just ask for more. Like, you're good. You're beating the game that makes that triples the investment.
I'm laughing really hard inside right now because you know how much you sound like a publisher.
Yeah, but that's the thing. the way you have to work with publishers eventually is just to understand why they make decisions, because that's how you work with publishers. Like, I think ultimately that's what publishers try to do. They try to understand developers, and it's always going to be imperfect, because unless you've been a developer, it's impossible to just understand how it feels to wake up in the morning and be like, okay, this bug yesterday didn't work. Today it does work, but I don't understand why it does work. And it's likely going to not work tomorrow. And then bash your head against the keyboard for like 4.5 hours. And just be like, I think it's worse than where I started. Right? Like that's developer life. And I think publishers, they don't fully understand sometimes that when we're late on a milestone, it's not because we suck. It's because, well, we suck at planning, but it's because we are generally like unsure frequently. That's
this thing I'm sure nobody in this room knows. Game development's hard.
It's super hard. Like, I think a lot of producers know that, but I think on the money side, it's rare that people fully understand that. They understand that it's risky. It's very different from difficult, right? So I think there's always sort of a translation, but I really believe that working with publishers, working with investors, is just try to understand why they make decisions. And for a publisher and investor both, it's just a return on investment. That's it.
I always say try to get yourself inside the other person's head, right? The more you understand where they're coming from, the easier. I know we're almost out of time.
Right.
I'm going to ask you this question, and I already did, and then we're going to see if they have any questions for the audience.
All right.
Advice for young Rami.
Nothing. I would give my young person nothing. I get this question a lot, but like the honest truth is that the version without advice got here, and I'm happy with here. And I watched too much Back to the Future to want to go back and like change anything because I don't know what would end up. But there was a game I funded for $30,000, and I later found out that I would have gotten $2.5 million for $250,000 for it. And I think I might give Rami a nudge that he can ask for more on that one, probably.
All right, so I know, again, nobody's here to hear me talk, so let's go for a few questions. I don't know how much time we have because we started late. Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
We can also start Q&A now and then just after talk afterwards. All right, cool.
Now let's go ahead and start Q&A. I mean,
Yeah, so we have 7 minutes for Q&A. Correct. All right. Questions.
Questions, please. Come on, somebody.
Did we terrify everybody? Everybody's terrified. Or we just answered all the questions already?
No, you know.
Or just nobody has questions?
I think they're actually waiting for.
No, there's a question right there.
Hello.
Hi.
This is not exactly about acquiring funding, but more about sort of the mental state of the developers while trying to achieve funding. Would you have any advice for, let's say, a company who's been going for 3 years straight? They've been kind of just making even and haven't gone up. And a lot of people are kind of discouraged in the development team, but the marketing team is still very forward and out there looking for stuff. But I didn't know if you had any way to, like, any advice to kind of help developers see things a bit clearer.
Right, so how the mental state of developers during the process of getting funding.
Yeah, especially after being going for quite a long time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, and it can be heartbreaking to have a thing and just not get it funded. And I work with teams that don't get their games funded for 6 months, a year, sometimes more than a year. And it's really hard. Like, the problem with those kind of things is, like, rejection is part of pitching, and it's part of being in the games industry. But it doesn't necessarily become easier, and especially not for your first works, right? You're not prepared the same way you're not prepared for your first hit, you're not prepared for your first flop. You can talk about it, but like it just, these kind of things hit. The best thing I recommend indies is just if you're gonna go for funding, try to spend as little time on the pre-funding part as possible, right? Instead of like trying to make everything perfect, get mock-ups, make quick prototypes, try to validate your game as early as possible. And people ask, like, how do you validate your business case? You validate it by pitching. Just start pitching. And if somebody, because the thing is, it doesn't have value until somebody pays for it. So you can start pitching as soon as you have a bunch of mock-ups, you know what the game is, you can explain it, you can explain why it's interesting, you have a prototype to prove it. You can go. You don't have to make that full vertical slice. Because if you're a young developer, they will ask for a vertical slice because you can't prove that you've shipped, right? So that's why they ask for a vertical slice, to prove that you can do the thing that you're promising. But you can technically also do that by hiring somebody who has shipped. So just up your budget for a producer that has shipped games and then put that there, right? Because no good producer is going to hop on board on a game that you can't deliver. So there's a bunch of like considerations, but the biggest one is just please pitch earlier. Like get to that point fast where you can communicate your game, because you can work for 2.5 years on a vertical slice and it's about a dog, and the publishers just all go like, no, dogs don't work in 2023. Stray is the thing now, so it has to be cats. And then you're like, well, shit, the game's about grabbing bones.
I always say, so I'm happy, like I looked at everything from literally pen and paper to full pitch. Obviously, if I'm gonna buy a car, I wanna test drive it, right?
Yep.
And I understand that's difficult because that's all the risk.
Mm-hmm.
Find the fun in that gray box. And like, honestly, I can tell you a couple of games that I funded most on spec were literally, it was a gray box on a screen, but the mechanic was just so fun that I was just like...
And some mock-ups, right?
Yeah.
Like, just like this is what it's going to look like.
They literally had one artist do 2 mock-ups of what that level, that the gray box was going to look like when it was done, so I could understand the vision, and then like a master art piece, and I think they paid that artist like $250.
Yeah.
And then they had a gray box, but the mechanic was this weird swinging mechanic that created loops on loops, and that was it. And it was like, how much do you need?
Yeah.
But honestly, one of the things I tell people, and as like Rami said, he wouldn't tell himself like in much of anything when he's young. Part of success is just surviving long enough to get lucky. And it's not a great strategy or business plan, but some of the companies, it's like the music artist that gets the award for the best new album that's been on the road for 10 years and released 10 albums. Yeah. Sometimes it's just surviving long enough. And I will say this too, and it may be difficult, sometimes when the motivation gets low, give everybody a week off. Just like take a week, go do something, refresh, come back with new. And it sounds kind of silly, but I think all of us, because we're trying to ship our babies, think we have to keep working on our baby every minute. And sometimes stepping away from the baby makes the baby much more attractive.
That's not advice for babies. It's advice for video games.
Okay, next question.
2 talks. You pick. You just pick which
Pick
one. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for these nice and interesting insights. My question is, so if I get an investor who's not a publisher in my game, and my game comes to shipping, should I partner with a publisher for marketing power and stuff?
I mean, if you are in a situation, like here's the thing, if you have an investor, and they have equity in the company, I presume, or? Like?
Just hypothetical.
All right. If you have an investor and they funded in the game, then the question is how are they going to make their money back, right? So you might have to share revenue with the investor after the game comes out. There's really 2 ways of doing it. A, you can work with a publisher, but B, if you have money, you can work with a marketing agency. And what effectively a publisher does is most publishers are not marketing companies. They hire marketing companies. Even things like Devolver Digital works with Tinsley PR and a number of other ones. So they're basically network organization. They connect you to other organizations that will help you QA, localization, marketing, stuff like that. So you can skip the middle. You can skip that middle team, right? Just skip the publisher and just go to a marketing agency. So it depends on how you are financially. If you're going to work with a publisher, I would still recommend you get some money out of it.
Yeah, I will say never give the publishing rights to somebody that doesn't give you some money up front.
That's what they're buying, and they shouldn't be able to buy rights to publish your game in exchange for doing some marketing. If you're going to do that, just launch the game as freeware. Might as well.
Yeah, no, this is one of my biggest pet peeves, especially I spent a lot of time in Latin America, come across a ton of developers. Well, they said they would market my game 50-50, and the problem is the game launches, the developer funded everything, game doesn't do really well, team doesn't market it, but they still have 50% rights, and they have it for 10 years, and then you're just dead in the water. So yeah, everybody needs to be bringing some value to the table if you're going to do that. So I think
we have 2 seconds.
2 seconds.
All right, I hope the mic works. Yes. We're going to move the Q&A outside of the door. There's a giant area where you can all get cozy and talk to each other. And please don't run Rami over. I think he doesn't want that much attention. But I will make sure that you can either get a mic there as well, so it'll sound a bit louder. But we'll figure something out there because speakers have to come back in here.
Hi.
So thank you very much for
Thank you, everybody.
all of this.